Don Kennedy is the editor-in-chief of Science magazine, which is the journal of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And he's actually one editor-in-chief removed from Dan Koshland, who, as many of you know, was one of our great faculty members and also performed marvelously as the editor of Science. Don's present research program entails policy on such transboundary environmental problems as major land uses, economically driven alterations in agricultural practice, global climate change, which we care about a lot here, and the development of regulatory policies. I won't go through the whole CV, but just note that he's nearing the end of his 5th decade as a Stanford faculty member, which I think it's extraordinary. I had dinner last night with one of his colleagues who's actually in his 7th decade of doing productive research, and I left there thinking, that's a fantastic goal to try to achieve when I step down as Chancellor, is 7 decades of science. But so you've still got approximately 2 to go, Don. He's giving the second part of his 2 lectures at Berkeley. Today, the title is Science and the University, an Evolutionary Tale, Part 2, Bayh-Dole and Enclosing the Frontier.
Chancellor, that was a terrific introduction, and I'm really grateful that you're sticking around. And I hope this will interest you and maybe prompt a question or two. I need to remind you that last week, those of you who were there, that last week I not only thanked Judd King, a wonderful host, and his fabulous assistant, Natalie, who's been taking wonderful care of me, and I also reminded everybody that it was a huge privilege for me to honor Clark Kerr, who was a hero to many of us, and to spend some time at the world's greatest public university. In my first lecture, I laid out a plan for all 3 of them, and in the first concentrated on the remarkable events that followed the war, in which the United States government had to decide where to decant the military research machine that had done so well in the war. And what it decided to do was to place support of fundamental science not in a system of government laboratories or some other such place, but rather to put it in the same places where the young scientists who will succeed the successes of the war were to be changed. Vannevar Bush, the director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development at the time, called his memorandum Science, the Endless Frontier, and that was a pretty powerful metaphor. It got people thinking about the Lewis and Clark expedition and all that unexplored territory that scientists could go to work on, and it obviously lit a considerable amount of enthusiasm in the university sector. Bush did not get all he wanted. He wanted a national research foundation with 5 divisions. A couple of them came up missing. Defense, because the mission agencies involved in defense decided that they wanted to get into the business of supporting fundamental research as well. And health, because the NIH was such a favored target for the congressional generosity, and because it very much wanted to take care of the health and biomedical science business. And that left Bush probably a little personally dissatisfied. He had believed profoundly in the unity of the sciences, talked about it a lot, and wanted them all together if possible. But it didn't happen that way. I note just one other thing about the Bush memorandum. It didn't say anything to speak of about patents and patenting at the end. Intellectual property is virtually absent from the memorandum. And so That was wonderful as far as the recipients of the generosity intended in that memorandum were concerned. The universities did wonderfully well, despite the fact that it didn't work out perfectly for Vannevar Bush. So we now turn to a second series of episodes, actually. They are often made to sound like one, but it's a long history, and you're going to find me moving forward and backwards and starting some parts of the story in the middle, and I'm going to try to tell you when I'm doing that, because it has had a kind of saltatory progression toward the Bayh-Dole Amendments of 1980, which did a remarkable thing. It produced for the endless frontier a kind of enclosure, a move toward proprietary management of scientific information that has really wrought a set of changes in universities and in university sciences that's in its way just as great as the change wrought in the aftermath of the endless frontier. So let me start the story with a quick personal note. This is really starting in the middle. I'm provost at Stanford in 1979-80, and I'm having a conversation with a Stanford faculty member named Stanley Cohen. Stanley Cohen is the Cohen of Cohen and Boyer and recombinant DNA, and they were pretty excited about what they had managed to achieve, and it will recur frequently in this account. The subject of our conversation was how to distribute the royalties that would represent Stanford's share of the joint Stanford-UC patent once the Office of Technology Licensing's expenses were taken off the top and Cal got its share, Stanford would get its, and the question was what was going to become of it. And my recollection of this negotiation confirmed in a phone call with Stanley Cohen not long ago, because I didn't want to say it like it wasn't. We had a sandwich and it was friendly, and we agreed pretty quickly on a distribution pattern that would give a third of the royalties as an investigator's share, which Stan generously delivered to the support of his laboratory, a third to the department, and a third to the school, in this case the School of Medicine. I can't be sure that that was the very first decision of this kind made under similar circumstances, but I've checked, and almost all other decisions made with respect to those kinds of distributions have been just about the same. Well, later in that same academic year, the Congress took that step that we've called the Bayh-Dole Amendments of 1980, and it really marks the beginning of this new era of academic science in the universities. What the legislative history of the Bayh-Dole Amendments very clearly shows is that the issue was all about patents. The whole purpose of the original Bush idea was to be sure that there was a fundamental scientific underpinning that could guarantee lots of ideas in the more commercial world that would be converted into, developed into products or services useful to society. And so Bush hadn't taken any account about patents, but in fact Bayh and Dole and their legislative staff started looking at the patent production from university research and found it very disappointingly low. And they said, look, if patents aren't being taken out and licenses issued on the basis of those patents, what is going to ensure that the technology that's developed in the universities is transferred into the products that we envisioned as being produced? So, the force of Bayh-Dole was to rescind any claim that the government would have on intellectual property rights, even for research discoveries made with federal dollars in universities. It was obviously a new game and very distinct from what had gone before. Well, at the same time that hearings were being held on the Bayh-Dole Amendments, I'm taking a little step back now, slight step, Stanford was one of the few universities that had already established an Office of Technology Licensing. Some of you may know the person who established it. His name is Niels Riemer. And he was so successful as a former electrical engineer, become intellectual property lawyer, that he was generally regarded as a kind of guru in setting up this kind of operation in universities. Indeed, later on, the University of California borrowed him to set up theirs, and later than that, MIT did the same thing. So Niels Riemer is a sort of figure in this story. He was quite intimately operating in the development of the legislation. He knew the staffs well. He delivered testimony in favor of the amendments, and things obviously moved forward with his considerable help. Well, in beginning with the Bayh-Dole Amendments themselves, I said I was really starting in the middle, and now I'm going to take a step back and point out that long before he was testifying before Congress about the Bayh-Dole Amendments, Riemer had already established an Office of Technology Licensing at Stanford. And that was in the 70s, when the whole issue of recombinant DNA, which was to yield the patent to Stanford and the University of California after the discoveries of Cohen and Boyer, was a matter of considerable controversy in the country. So the first test you had of a patentable discovery, at least in the biomedical area, was made in an area where lots of people thought it was a pretty bad idea. I remember being at the National Academy of Sciences at a meeting in the lecture hall there, at which several geneticists and others were discussing recombinant DNA. That was just after the well-known Asilomar conference, in which the practitioners of this technology gathered and wondered whether a voluntary hold shouldn't be put on it because there was so much concern about it. Well, at this meeting at the National Academy of Sciences, I'm sitting on the platform. We're having a little discussion with the geneticist Tracy Sonnenborn, and a bunch of people marched into the lecture room, some of them shouting. They were brandishing signs that said, "Don't Xerox life." They billed themselves as something called the People's Business Commission, and the leader was Jeremy Rifkin, of whom you may have subsequently heard. Well, that was recombinant DNA at that moment. It was something that was scientifically exciting and promising. It was also not without a very substantial controversy. And soon after those kinds of events, we had a situation in which people started worrying about how was the government going to protect its citizens in case something bad happened as a consequence of this new technology. And so there was much discussion about how it would be managed in a regulatory sense. There was an interagency committee chaired by Don Fredrickson, the director of NIH. I actually served on that committee because I was temporarily affiliated with the new Office of Science and Technology Policy at the time. And the concern was that perhaps regulating recombinant DNA research would be given to the Environmental Protection Agency. And I can tell you that scientists who did that kind of work were really unenthusiastic about the prospect that they would be regulated by the Environmental Protection Agency. So as this struggle moved back and forth, eventually Don Fredrickson carried the day, and recombinant DNA research was to be regulated where the scientists had some confidence that it would be regulated not entirely in a way that would constitute a serious block to at least a certain amount of research progress. In fact, the RAC, as it is called by everybody, has been reasonably cautious and certainly has accomplished good public protection. Well, at the time that the Bayh-Dole discussion is beginning, that was going on, and so was the question of whether Stanford and the University of California would undertake to patent the technology. Bob Rosenzweig was then Stanford's vice president for public affairs, and he sent a memo around to the Stanford faculty who were doing this kind of work and said, what do you think about patenting it? Interestingly, there was some opposition. Some faculty members thought that it was really just not consistent with their vision of a university, their university, that it would go out and declare proprietorship with respect to a particular technology. I would not say, because I do not know, whether that was a majority view of any kind, but it certainly appeared, and there were arguments on campus about whether getting into the patenting business and licensing business at all was something that was appropriate for a university to do. In fact, regardless of some objections, the effort to patent it moved forward, and as soon as Bayh-Dole was clearly there, it was done, and in fact it had been done even before Bayh-Dole passed, because the institution could qualify for a special exemption and did so that the patent could be issued. I must say that many of Stanford's inventors could have at the same time done what Cohen and Boyer could have done, and that is ignored the university and gone out and patented their discovery themselves. At Stanford at the time, incidentally, there was no rule that you couldn't do that. Many universities, the majority perhaps, had such rules. Stanford didn't. And for the entire decade of the 1980s, somewhat to my surprise, everybody who made an interesting invention at Stanford chose to go through the Office of Technology Licensing and have Stanford get the patent. I was a little surprised by that, but imagine my surprise when my successor along about 94 or 95 made the decision that Stanford would reverse that policy and instead claim patenting rights to all faculty inventions made on campus. Well, I expected that from computer science and electrical engineering there would be a storm of protest. The silence was absolutely deafening. Most people actually just appeared not to notice. So the issue of should the university patent or not, should individual investigators be allowed to patent on their own, sort of stopped being a matter of serious controversy in the institution. We were in the business in which the university would regularly patent faculty discoveries, and they would then develop licenses, negotiate licenses with companies to do work under those patents. Now, looking back on the eventual effects of the Bayh-Dole amendments, I think I can say without exaggeration that it was transformative for the research university, for all of them. The drama that unfolded was not entirely due to the new legislation. There had been preceding changes in the tax laws. that sort of brought venture capital into a position where it could make investments in small companies based on inventions made by faculty members in universities. So the situation had really changed. Professor Smith in immunology or Jones in computer science could go to OTL. They could get the have Stanford take out the patent, and then they would talk to some other people. They would talk to some venture capitalists who might or might not happen to be friends of trustees or regents. They would work out an arrangement to fund an offshore venture, rent space, and hire other scientists to go to work developing products or processes derived from their new idea. Now, that immediately set in place an interesting array of problems for university administrators, and I want to spend some time talking about those because a lot of us worried about them very seriously at the time, as Bob can well imagine or attest. So Smith or Jones, from the previous example, could be scientific consultants, or they could be members of the scientific advisory board or its chairman. I think we generally decided that they could not have management positions that required them to spend substantial amounts of their time offshore. We held our consulting limits, as most other institutions did, of a day a week or 13 days a quarter. So then the question was, how would the licenses be issued and what would follow? They might want an exclusive license, either because they feared that other competition would enter, or because they felt that only they would have the technical expertise to make an advantage out of what had been patented. That's what Stanford and the University of California confronted when they were deciding how to license the recombinant DNA patent. And I think they did a good job. They offered pretty low starting prices, very low rates on the licenses, and as a result, they attracted over 250 licensees, and that process did very well for both institutions until a fairly recent one from the East took first place in the single most lucrative patent. This was King of the Mountain. Well, so beyond licensing, there were some other problems that presented themselves to university administrators. First of all, what about graduate students? What about Professor Jones's graduate student? Is it okay for Jones to say, would you mind this summer just coming offshore with me and working in the company and letting this thesis go? It's going fine, you'll be all right. Well, the Committee on Graduate Studies and Research thought that there was more than a whiff of coercion in that potential relationship, and so it decided that probably it ought to make a rule about that. What about relationship between work at the new company and work at the investigator's university lab? How close could they merge? What about charitable gifts from the offshore corporate entity to support research in the investigator's lab? How do we feel about that? How would the IRS feel about that? Complicated question. And we wrestled perhaps most intensively with the most troublesome of all, maybe the first question to leap to the minds of boards of trustees. Would it be appropriate for the university, seeing a good idea with a good patent and a briskly performing offshore company licensed from that patent, would the university care to co-invest in that venture with part of its endowment? Well, now I'm going to switch to policy responses to those challenges, and I can cite a little bit of history here. For me, the question of what you do about that first arose prominently at a meeting I was at in 1981 with Derek Bok, the very thoughtful and fine former president of Harvard. It was the year after Bayh-Dole, and we're appearing together at a gathering organized and sponsored by the Committee for Corporate Support of Private Universities. And Bok begins with an interesting statement. He says, we're there to discuss how universities could cooperate with business, not only in fundraising, but in trying to speed the translation of knowledge into innovations that can benefit the economy and improve productivity. Vannevar Bush could have made that statement. He then told a story about his daughter, Hillary, announcing at the breakfast table, as she did once, "Daddy, what on earth is your picture doing on the front page of the New York Times?" It turned out that there was a story there announcing that Harvard was considering going into business with a member of its faculty in a venture that the faculty member had started, having first obtained a patent through Harvard. And at the meeting, Bok raised some good questions surrounding the university's proposed role as co-entrepreneur. The temptations facing Bok and the rest of us at the time were pretty strong. We were just emerging from double-digit inflation. Remember, this is early Reagan. NSF fellowship support for graduate students had been cut quite drastically. There were deep worries about the future support for science. When Harvard decided not to co-invest with its faculty member, the New York Times clever headline writer reported, "Harvard shuns Apple, fails to step on serpent." Now, what they meant was, this is a larger problem than just does one institution decide or not decide to co-invest with its faculty member. It's a big problem. What about the best of it? Well, that ambiguity was eventually removed, and soon there came about some much more collegial discussion, I think, about how higher education could develop some policies or at least guidelines to deal with the new reality. The co-investment issue eventually looked like a no-brainer to most university presidents. We asked ourselves, for example, how other faculty members, formerly colleagues of the favored co-entrepreneur, would feel about relative salary differences or allocations of space. It clearly could present a problem in terms of intra-institutional equity. There would be other ancillary questions. Would the prospect of such institutional participation add a significant incentive for faculty to change their own research focus and move to other areas that might be more profitable and therefore curry the institution's fiscal favor more persuasively? So I think that the principle of no co-investment may now be occasionally breached, but I don't follow these developments very clearly anymore, very closely anymore, and so I can't say for sure whether they're honored often in the breach. Anyway, we decided that some structured efforts to keep track of these issues were required, and I was inspired in part by a lunch I had in Los Angeles with Arnold Beckman. He had brought a special personal history to the issue of how academics go into business. As an assistant professor at Caltech, he had been asked by a colleague to invent a device with electrodes of a certain sort that could measure the acidity of fruit juice. The colleague was an agricultural scientist. And Beckman decided that he could probably do that, and he produced a prototype machine, which you will by now have guessed was the first pH meter. And what Dr. Beckman, who I did not call Arnold then or later, described making a trip east with his wife Mabel and the first pH meter to Philadelphia, where Van Waters and Rogers was ready to leap on the opportunity and make it one of the first major instruments that they marketed. And of course it led to the Beckman Instrument Company and a series of later fusions. What did Arnold Beckman do confronting this remarkable success? Did he start a little offshore Beckman Instruments and keep his position on the Caltech faculty? No. He said, if you're going to go into business, you should go into business. So he left the faculty. Perhaps a witness can be found at Caltech or Stanford or the University of Illinois who thinks that was a really bad decision, but I doubt it. In any event, my impression is that he was concerned and even suspicious about faculty involvement with offshore commercial enterprises. And before the lunch was over, he had urged that, he said, you and some other presidents ought to have a meeting and talk this thing through and see what you think about it. And he said, in fact, I'd enjoy being there and being a part of it and making some suggestions of my own. Well, those auspices were pretty good, and so we became involved in a group meeting that included Stanford, the University of California, of course, Harvard, Caltech, and MIT. Why those institutions? Well, the presidents all knew each other. It is not that, as my friend Bob Rosenzweig said in a rather sardonic note, it is not an OPEC for molecular biology. Rather, it was that we had confidence that a good mix of university presidents and trustees, each brought a couple of trustees, hoping to pick ones that were particularly thoughtful and knowledgeable about the commercial sector. We all got together at a place called Pajaro Dunes in California. Some of you may know it. David Saxon and Derek Bach particularly liked that place. We got support from the Henry J. Kaiser Foundation, and we had a long 2.5 days of discussion in which we said, do you think, to one another, do you think we can generate a set of guidelines or guiding principles that might be influential in sorting out all of these opportunities and challenges that institutions are facing separately? Well, perhaps somewhat to my surprise, the attendees came to an agreement of that kind. There was a recommendation for non-exclusive rather than exclusive licensing where possible. The most important agreed upon notions, I think, were these. First, that universities should not co-invest with faculty members in forming their new licensed commercial enterprises. And second, that the licensing agreements made by universities should be structured toward the objective of getting discoveries of potential human impact, human value, promptly into human service. In short, the principle was that technology transfer and the desirability of transferring technology ought to trump revenue potential wherever those two conflicted. A subsequent conference at the University of Pennsylvania reached with somewhat broader representation, looked at those issues, generally agreed with them and produced similar guidelines. That conference, called Partners in the Research Enterprise, is a useful reference for anybody who wants to follow this particular history. Well, at Stanford, my colleagues and I were soon to face a set of particular problems not explicitly covered by what we did in Pajaro Dunes. Most of these related to the question of how much separation would we insist on between a faculty member's offshore enterprise and his or her onshore laboratory. We wouldn't co-invest Stanford's endowment with Professor X's venture, but we would have to be sure that there was not some conflict of interest in the ownership. For example, suppose one of the university's trustees was a limited partner in the venture firm that was responsible for funding it. We also looked at the possibility of cross-migration of graduate students, as I mentioned before. And our Committee on Graduate Studies took a firm line on that. Because money can also migrate, we had to make a rule about whether off-campus companies should make gifts related to their professors' operation on campus, and we decided that they shouldn't. There was another entry that had to do with research relationships. You can't just say there can't be any communication between your offshore laboratory and the laboratory on campus. That would be like my telling my peer reviewers at Science that they have to forget everything they read in the last manuscript and not base anything on it. It's not going to happen. So you can't construct a perfect firewall. I found myself in an interesting conversation at the President's house with Irv Weissman, a very distinguished stem cell biologist, about what he was doing in his offshore laboratory at Systemics. He had isolated the stem cells that form all the blood elements. And in mice that were also immunosuppressed, he'd been able to find some human cells that were the analog of the stem cells for blood-forming elements in the mice, and reconstitute a whole human immune system in these immunosuppressed mice. It was a remarkable achievement. So in his offshore company, what he wanted to do was to pursue human stem cells and their potential, whereas he was entirely going to work on mice in his laboratory on campus. I was really thoroughly convinced that the arrangements that he had made were more than adequate. I mean, I thought that they were conscientious, and I thought that it was important that I understand that a serious attempt had been made to strongly limit communication and crosstalk. Well, the impact of the Bayh-Dole Amendments as a sort of general societal phenomenon has drawn some attention from a number of commentators. Heller and Eisenberg, in a challenging paper that they published in Science several years ago, point out that the thicket of patents and licenses is converting what they say should be a knowledge commons into a knowledge anti-commons, in which communication is constricted because rights quickly move from unassigned to property status, and multiple owners have exclusion rights. A group at Duke, Wesley Cohen, Don O'Brien, and colleagues, have studied that situation more carefully. They say that, yeah, there are problems, but there are workarounds, and people manage to resolve those difficulties, and so they can't be all that serious. So now we have to ask the different question, not how many problems have Bayh-Dole amendments produced, but have they been successful in bringing about the results that congressional sponsors hoped for? The number of patents obtained by universities is now about 16 times as high annually as it was in 1980. And the university's share of all patents is up by a factor of 5. Licensing income now totals about $1 billion per year, with a few big winners accounting for most of that. And this is a hold your breath statistic. There are 3,300 technology transfer offices in American institutions of higher education. I didn't know that many places did serious research, but some of them have technology transfer offices just in case, maybe. Anyway, the new world has brought some unexpected risks for universities. For one thing, universities sometimes get seen as though they were like sort of profit licensing shops are acting as patent trolls, patent holders who make no product but crouch under bridges to leap out and confront a producer with an infringement claim. And that's not a reputation that you want to get. But there is a stirring of controversy between universities and related commercial organizations with respect to infringement claims and the rewards to universities for those kinds of claims. And I'm going to point a finger here, which I normally don't like to do, but there is a noted case involving big economic winners in which a Columbia University patent for co-transformation, a method by which inserted genes can be translated in eukaryotic cells. This technique this patent for this technique had a 17-year term, earned for Columbia about nearly $800 million in royalties, so it was a big winner. But as its patent term dwindled, the university pursued latent divisional patents on the same basic technique that it had applied for earlier. That's something that competitors really get annoyed about. They call them submarine patents, designed to surface at the proper time of patent expiration. These were issued just after the original patents expired, and in response, some infuriated licensees refused to pay royalties. They sued Columbia for double patenting. Columbia sued them back as infringers. Critics were leveling charges of submarine patenting or worse, and finally the whole matter got settled. But to me, shockingly, it was not settled until after Columbia had tried and failed to get a legislative patent extension term, particularly for that patent from the Congress, and I think that was a piece of legislative pork that we could well do without. Well, I don't know exactly what universities can do to avoid that. I think they should be very careful about what they patent, whether it's really necessary to have a patent in the particular area in which it's being suggested. I think that playing it cautiously and not assuming instantly that everything needs to receive some kind of intellectual property protection is worth being careful about. The problem is that universities have a particular understood mission in its patrons on the part of its patrons in this country, and when it gets a little too commercial, it loses some of that. When a bunch of us who've been presidents in the 1980s were gathered by a friendly force someplace and asked to say what they thought the biggest challenges for the next generation of university presidents would be, Derek Bach, always wise, said, the most serious problem for the president is going to be deciding what's for sale and what isn't. So I want to now conclude this treatment of the brand new scientific environment of Bayh-Dole by returning to the metaphor of the knowledge commons suggested by the endless frontier and that metaphor. It certainly sent a powerful message. I pointed out last week that it evoked a vision of Lewis and Clark and reminded Americans that science was wide open to exactly that kind of imaginative exploration. It made a successful case for that huge decision to make exploration into basic science a public responsibility, thereby displacing research from the responsibility of small privileged elites and putting it into the hands of a vast public enterprise from which scientific explorers and ultimately society could draw very close to the original idea. Well, the metaphor suggests a historical commons, invites us to think in terms of a contemporary knowledge commons in intellectual property. Surely Bush and his followers believed that individual scientists with good ideas could graze freely on his science frontier commons. And from 1950 to the late 1970s, we surely all did. But it may be instructive to remember what happened to the Western frontier as a real estate commons a century earlier. Late in the 19th century, it was transformed from public land into a checkerboard of individual holdings. The federal government lacked the resources to undertake publicly funded improvement of that kind of vast project, so it was confronted after the Civil War by an overflow of citizens eager to take advantage of the vast public lands west of the Mississippi. There was a great enclosure then that followed, made possible by the Homestead Act of 1862, which allocated 160-acre lots to any settler who would settle down and improve that lot for 5 years. There were big railroad grants that supported the extension of transportation into those newly owned lands. And so it was a remarkable step. And I don't think it's unreasonable to view the Bayh-Dole Amendments as the Homestead Act of the Endless Frontier. In it, Congress gave up the government's, that is the public's, rights to the intellectual property resulting from the work it had supported on the commons. And in effect, it did for intellectual property what the Homestead Act had done many years before for real property. At the risk of pushing this analogy farther than it may be willing to travel, let me explore a couple of other respects in which it may have lessons for us. The later history of the Homestead Act enclosure is mixed. It worked really well in the tall grass prairie, not so well in the water-short regions of the western prairie, particularly the basin and range. In some of the more remote western lands, topographically and resource extraction-wise, alternatives were offered to farming, and the whole possession algorithm of the Homestead Act wasn't destined to work very well. The classic conflicts of Western films between mobile grazers and settled agriculturalists, the cowboys versus the sodbusters, are another added domain of complexity. Conflicting claims, abandoned homesteads, range wars defeated many of the hopes of the Homestead Act. And in the far Mountain West, much of the land the government might have intended to turn over had such difficult vertical topography and therefore no takers, leaving us with the splendid public lands that occupy so much of that region and delight tourists, explorers, timber extractors, and scientists. Well, what will the future hold for the new endeavor created for intellectual property by Bayh-Dole? Early indications are that in some respects it's repeating some of that Homestead Act history. As I suggested, there have been numerous patent disputes, unpleasant charges leveled against university behavior. Nothing yet amounts to anything like a range war, but it's not much fun to be called a patent troll. One especially serious concern arises, for me at least, from the prospect that in this new world of publicly owned germplasm resources might somehow be taken over by a new commercial entity because nobody was looking very carefully, thus converting to private hands what had formerly been a public resource. Well, I hunted around and I tried to find good examples of cases in which the commercialization of that endless frontier had resulted in a kind of takeover of what had always been assumed to be a publicly owned, freely available resource. I couldn't find one, but I finally have a story from an odd and not inappropriate place. It comes from a historian colleague of mine named Richard White, with whom I taught for a time. And I asked Richard once, ever occur to you that some kind of publicly owned resource, germplasm or something of that sort, might actually be taken over by one of these commercial entities? He says, no. He said, but I had a really funny experience once myself. I said, what was it? He said, my third book about Western U.S. history, I had a great title for it. I want to call it, It's All Your Misfortune and None of My Own. You will perhaps recognize that as a line from Get Along, Little Doggie, a classic ballad always assumed by everyone, including my colleague, Professor Richard White, to be a public property. Turned out that it had been enclosed. Richard had to pay $250 to use it. Why? Because the folk music collector Alan Lomax had recorded the cowboy ditty in many places from many groups, put all the recorded versions together, and copyrighted it on publishing it. So it cost Richard $250. Well, of course, it's the wildest kind of speculation, but the metaphor and the analogy to the public commons suggests something to me, and that is that if science and the science commons is really a public resource, what we need to do is to be very careful that in encouraging the transfer of technology, we don't damage the openness and the community of the old frontier. Thank you very much. I hope some of you will have some questions.
You've talked a lot about the transfer of technology to society to make it beneficial to people, hopefully. But I was wondering if there are studies on what effect all this patenting activity and the professors that have their feet in both camps, so to speak, what effect has that had on the basic science enterprise at research universities?
I think that study is yet to be done, and it probably should be. We have very little information anyway about the impact of basic research on subsequent developments in certain sectors. There was a study done by the Defense Department on what basic research results had resulted in things important to the military establishment. And Comroe and Drips did a very thoughtful study on that in the biomedical and health sector. But the interesting study would be to compare that for the decade 1960 to 1980, and then use that as the historical control for the decade 1980 to 2010. And it's not, as far as I know, no one has proposed it. It's a good idea.